I came back to Okinawa in the early summer of 1993. The heat rose off the fields in soft waves, yet the ground under my boots felt cooler than it should. I stood at the base of the old hill where my platoon had set charges almost 5 decades earlier. The concrete plug was still there, cracked in thin lines that looked like they had grown on their own. A faint breath of air slipped out of those cracks. It carried the same sour touch of the sea that I remembered from 1945, even though the shoreline lay far behind another ridge. The others checked gear and marked positions, but my eyes stayed fixed on the stone. I felt the same quiet pull I had felt as a young combat engineer, the same warning running along the skin of my arms. Something below us had waited a long time. The years had passed for me, not for it. Before we start the video, hit the subscribe button to support the channel. I first saw that hill in the spring of 1945. Our line had pushed south, and my engineer squad was told to clear another cave system before the infantry moved in. Most days followed the same order. We checked air, checked stability, checked for traps, then burned out pockets or set charges. The work was steady and harsh, and we learned to move without talking much. The limestone around Okinawa held heat in the day and cooled fast at night, so the caves breathed in slow pulses, like the island itself was alive. This one hill sat alone above a set of old terraces. Nothing about it looked special from a distance. The grass was short, the rocks pale, and the slope gentle. What caught my eye was how the soil near the base stayed damp, while the ground around it stayed dusty. Our boots left dark prints there even when the sun was strong. A few Marines joked about hidden springs. I kept my thoughts to myself. Water inside a hill that high from the coast did not sit right with me. We found the mouth of the tunnel behind a cluster of broken shrubs. The opening was narrow and rough, like someone had hacked at it in a hurry. Warm air flowed out in soft waves, thick with a salty smell that did not belong that far inland. I remember rubbing my sleeve across my face and trying to place it. It was not the clean bite of ocean air. It was closer to the scent of a tide pool left too long under the sun. A corporal beside me asked if something had died inside. I told him we would find out soon enough. We moved in with lights and a flamethrower team at our back. The tunnel bent left, then right, then dropped in a shallow slope that felt natural in some places and forced in others. The walls were smooth and long streaks, almost polished by hands or tools. Thin lines of moisture ran down in neat paths. When my light hit them, they shone like threads. I could hear soft drops falling in the dark ahead, steady but slow. We reached the first chamber after a short walk. Supplies were stacked in tidy rows. Blankets, rations, canteens, rough shelves cut into stone. It looked more like a shelter than a stronghold. We found civilians mixed with soldiers there, all crouched near the far wall. Some held their hands up. Others kept their eyes on the deeper passage behind them. They looked tired, hollow, and resigned. None reached for weapons. None tried to run. A Japanese officer stepped forward. He spoke quickly to our interpreter. The look on our interpreter's face changed. He said the officer wanted the tunnel sealed at once. That did not fit the usual pattern. Most caves held a fight, or at least a standoff. This group seemed more afraid of what lay behind them than of us. I studied that deeper passage. It angled down and widened into a dark throat. The officer kept glancing at it as if he waited for something to appear. He repeated his request, softer this time. Seal it. Seal it now. He pointed at me when he said it. I had the demolition gear. We pulled everyone out, soldiers and civilians alike. They did not protest. A few even hurried toward the light behind us, stumbling in their relief. Once we reached open ground, our squad leader ordered a full collapse of the main entry. I set the charges along the points where the rock would fold best. My hands moved the way training taught them to move. Yet I could not shake the feeling that something deeper than stone pressed against that tunnel mouth. When we blew the charges, the hillside shook in a short, hard burst. Dust rose in a white cloud. The air held still for a moment, like it waited. Then I heard it, a faint knock, then another, slow and spaced out. It came from behind the debris, steady and patient. I remember turning my head, thinking it had to be settling rock. But the knocks kept a rhythm that did not fit any shift I had heard before. We reported the collapse and moved on to the next assignment. The campaign pushed forward. Days blurred into nights. The smell of that tunnel stayed with me. The damp stone, the strange calm of those people. The officer who feared what lay deeper. War teaches you to keep moving. I did. Yet each time I cleaned my gear, I found my thoughts drifting back to that hillside. The knocks had not sounded like distress. They had sounded like someone marking time. Years passed after the war. I built a different life, married, had work, raised children. I told few stories from that spring, no matter who asked. Some memories settle into quiet corners of the mind and do not move. That sealed tunnel became one of mine. Still, on nights when wind rattled old windows or rain slipped between boards, I sometimes thought I heard a soft knock. 3 taps. A pause. 3 more. Distance made it easy to ignore, yet I never forgot the pattern. In 1993, when the letter arrived inviting me back to Okinawa for a recovery and research effort, I felt the weight of many years settle on my hands as I held the paper. They needed veterans who remembered unmarked demolitions. They wanted to locate sealed sites and bring closure to families. When I read the coordinates, something tightened in my chest. The hill was on the list. I hesitated before agreeing. Part of me wanted to leave the past in its place. Another part, older and heavier, needed to see what had waited behind that collapsed face of stone. I signed the form, packed light, and traveled back across the ocean. The island had changed. Roads cut across fields that once held foxholes. New houses stood where old rubble had been. Yet when I reached the southern ridges, the land felt the same as it had in 1945. The wind carried salt, the grass bent in the same slow way, and the hill waited exactly where I had left it. By the time our team set up around the old plug, dusk settled along the terraces. The cracks along the concrete glimmered with tiny beads of moisture. That same smell drifted out, faint but clear. It touched the back of my throat and pulled me straight into memory. I knew then that whatever sat behind that seal had not changed in 48 years. The team that gathered around the hill in 1993 came from 2 nations in many fields. There were engineers from the Japan Self-Defense Force, a few American specialists, an Okinawan interpreter, 2 archaeologists, and several local workers trained in safe recovery. I was the oldest by far. Most of them had not been born when I first stood on that slope with a demolition bag over my shoulder. They treated me kindly, though I could tell they were unsure what an old combat engineer could offer besides memory. We walked the ground before touching any tools. The hillside felt almost the same as it had in my youth, yet something subtle had changed. The soil held more moisture than the weather explained. The limestone along the lower edge carried a thin sheen, as if sea air had soaked into it for years without drying. When I brushed my hand across it, the coolness stayed on my skin longer than it should. One of the Japanese engineers noticed me check my hand and asked if the stone felt unusual. I told him it always felt that way here. I did not add that it had bothered me since the war. Our main point of focus was the old plug. It rose from the slope like a blunt tooth, its surface rough and weathered. The cracks along it were not wide, but they ran deep. Some formed straight lines I could follow with my finger. Others curved in thin arcs that reminded me of watermarks on a river stone. When the first breeze of the evening passed over us, the smell from those lines thickened a little. It carried a touch of brine and something older, like the scent of wet rock inside a long, closed place. The archaeologists wanted to go in slow. They spoke about respect, careful layers, full records. The engineers, both American and Japanese, wanted to work faster. They worried the old plug might shift as we cleared around it. I understood both sides, but the longer I stood there, the more I felt that the hill itself listened to us. I kept glancing at the ground near my boots. Thin drops gathered along small cracks in the stone, lining up in neat rows. They had not been there a moment before. We started by mapping the old blast line. I pointed out where we had placed charges all those years ago. Much of the original rubble had settled into the hill, though parts still showed fractures from the force. The more we studied the site, the clearer it became that we had collapsed only the front section of the tunnel. The deeper structure must have remained intact. That meant the old officer's warning had been left unanswered for nearly half a century. When we drilled the first small borehole into the plug, the sound of the bit echoed in a strange way. It did not carry the hollow tone I expected. It felt like the rock behind absorbed part of the vibration. We pushed through layer by layer until the drill eased forward. A thin belt of warm air slid out around the bit. The interpreter smelled it first and stepped back. He pressed a cloth to his nose as if the air struck him hard. To me, the scent felt familiar. Damp stone, old sea. The kind of smell that settles behind memory and waits. The engineers fed a narrow camera lens through the borehole. The small monitor flickered in the low light. At first we saw dust lingering in the beam. Then the first chamber appeared. It looked like a room caught between 2 moments. Some stones lay where the roof had fallen. Other objects sat untouched, as if someone had placed them down a short time ago. Bones rested in careful rows along one wall. Most were surely from 1945. A few looked arranged rather than scattered, like someone had set them upright and stepped away. The archaeologists leaned closer to the screen. They noted strands of mineral film hanging from the ceiling, thin as threads, glistening as the camera passed. One of the Japanese engineers asked if the room had ever been flooded. I told him no. The land above had always been dry. He frowned at that because the patterns of moisture did not match a normal cave. We pulled the camera back and checked the audio feed. At first, nothing came through except the soft hiss of air moving across the lens. Then a faint impact reached us. A small, gentle tap, a long pause. Another tap. The younger member said it had to be falling debris from above. I listened closer. The rhythm did not fit falling stone. It carried the same patient weight I had heard behind the rubble in 1945. That night, we gathered to discuss next steps. The archaeologists wanted to widen the entry so we could remove remains and record the chamber. The engineers insisted we test stability first. Local officials wanted answers for families, not delays. The air grew thicker as we talked, and the smell from the cracks drifted into our meeting area, no matter how the wind shifted. I kept touching my thumb to the inside of my palm, an old habit from wartime whenever unease crept in. I lay awake in my small room that night, listening to the island's usual sounds. Crickets, a distant truck, the soft hum of electric lights. Beneath all of it, barely there, I sensed 3 gentle taps. A pause. 3 more. It might have been pipes. It might have been my thoughts reaching back through the years. But when I closed my eyes, I saw the officer from 1945 again. He had stood between us and the dark behind him, not out of pride, but fear. The next morning, when we climbed the slope again, more droplets lined the stone. They formed small chains that ran down the cracks like beads pulled by unseen hands. The air carried that same quiet pulse I remembered from my youth, the kind that seemed to rise and fall as if the earth were breathing beneath us. I knew then we would not leave the hill untouched. Too many people needed answers. Too many years had passed. I also knew that whatever we found inside would not match any record from the war. Some places hold their own history, separate from ours. This hill felt like one of them. Work began slow the next day. We cleared soil from around the old plug, brushing away loose earth and bits of fractured limestone. The more we uncovered, the clearer the shape became. The concrete did not match what my squad had poured in 1945. Parts of it looked newer. Thin seams ran across the surface where someone else had patched it after the war. One patch sat low on the left side, no wider than a hand, with edges too clean to be old. A Japanese engineer crouched beside it and traced the line. He said the mixture looked different from the American blend. When he tapped it, the sound came back dull, as if the space behind had filled with something more than air. We moved our tools and set sensors around the slope. A geologist placed vibration meters along the stone. Their small lights blinked in uneven pulses. He told us the hillside breathed in slow cycles, not from weather but from pressure within. I watched the small lights for a long moment. The cycle did not follow the wind. It followed its own rhythm, rising and falling in careful steps. Around midday, we widened the borehole. The camera slipped inside again, this time at a different angle. The chamber looked unchanged from our first view. Dust drifted through the beam like snow. The rows of bones seemed at rest. Some uniforms hung in tatters over ribs. A few skulls leaned forward as if listening. I studied the left corner of the screen. Something faint glimmered there. Thin drops collected along the stone, forming tiny chains of moisture that reminded me of the ones outside. They clung to the wall and caught light in pale arcs. The archaeologist pointed toward a dark side passage beyond the reach of the camera. She asked if it existed in 1945. I told her I remembered a deeper passage, but not one shaped like that. The old one had sloped down. This one angled away with a broad, rough cut. Its mouth looked scraped, not carved. The lines along the stone suggested someone had widened it at a later time. She asked if we had built or blown any side openings. I shook my head. My charges went straight across the first corridor. That deeper cut should have been sealed by the falling rubble. As the camera turned, a faint pressure settled on the small room where we stood. It pressed behind the ears, the kind of weight you feel when entering a deep cave, or when the air shifts just before a storm. The interpreter removed his hat and rubbed the back of his neck. He said the air felt heavy, like something old had woken. One of the Japanese engineers, a younger man with steady hands, leaned closer to the monitor. He tilted his head slightly. He said he heard something faint on the feed. We all listened. At first I heard nothing. Then the tapping returned. 3 knocks. A long breath. 3 more. They sounded clearer than the day before. They sounded closer. The geologist replayed the audio through his equipment. The knocks sharpened as he cleaned the frequencies. No echo came with them. It was as if the sound reached the microphone without touching the chamber around it. A straight path from source to sensor. That troubled me more than if the whole room had shaken. By late afternoon, we had enough data to plan a partial entry. The engineers wanted to cut a rectangle into the old plug, about as wide as a man's shoulders. They said the stone around the opening was stronger than expected and would hold during a controlled cut. The archaeologists asked for time to prepare protective crates for remains. Local officials asked when families could expect news. Each voice pulled the project forward. I stood a few paces from the team and looked at the hill. The grass swayed in thin lines across its back. The air shimmered above the stone, and in the smallest moments, when no one spoke, I sensed the quiet pulse beneath my feet. It reminded me of the rhythm I felt when crouched in caves during the war, waiting for orders. The island had a way of breathing through stone. Only this place breathed deeper. We began the cut the next morning. Sparks touched the air as the first blade met the old concrete. The smell of dust mixed with that familiar damp scent drifting from the cracks. The blades moved steady, carving slow arcs. The sound filled the clearing, yet under it, I still caught faint taps. They came between the bursts of noise, almost hiding within them. My breath tightened each time I heard them. The sound felt like someone marking each step we took. After hours of careful work, the first corner loosened. A warm draft pushed out against our legs, soft at first, then steady. It carried a smell that froze me in place. Damp rock, stale sea. I tasted salt on the back of my tongue. It was the same smell that had followed me across decades. The same smell I thought I had left behind. We paused the cut and tested the air. The meters showed normal levels of oxygen, though the temperature inside the crack read a few degrees lower than the air outside. The archaeologists used brushes to clear the edges. The Japanese engineer who had noticed the new patch earlier knelt beside the gap. He held his hand near the opening, palm open. He said the air felt like it flowed with a slow beat, not a steady stream. The team agreed to widen the cut by only a little more before sending the camera through again. As the gap grew, more of the interior came into view. The chamber's floor lay just a short distance inside. Bones rested where they had been for nearly half a century. Some were arranged in rows that looked too neat for a collapse. The archaeologist whispered that someone must have touched them after the war. The interpreter translated this for the local workers. A few stepped back, uneasy. Then the camera swept toward the deeper passage again. This time, the light caught a rough mark on the wall. The archaeologist leaned in. She said it looked like writing. The letters curled in a style she did not recognize at first. The interpreter studied the lines and said they were Japanese, though old and hurried. He read them slowly. He said they meant something close to keep this closed. The words struck me with a force stronger than any blast I had said in my youth. I had heard those same words from the officer we found in 1945. His voice had been calm but certain. I remembered how he had pointed at me no differently than if he had known my job. Seal it. Seal it now. A silence settled over the team. No one spoke for a long heartbeat. The wind moved through the grass at the top of the slope. The smell drifting from the gap grew sharper. It carried the same mix of stone and sea that had once clung to my uniform for days. We resumed work, because standing still would only draw out the fear. The final cut came loose with a soft crack. The engineers eased the piece of concrete out and set it aside. A dark opening waited before us, wide enough for a man to slip through. The air flowing out felt colder than the numbers showed. The moisture along the stone glimmered under our lights in thin patterns that ran like veins. The archaeologist asked for the camera handoff, and the lens slid forward. The beam shone across the chamber. Dust swirled, bones waited. The deeper passage yawned open, and somewhere within that dark, a slow knot began, steady and patient, as if greeting us after a long delay. We made our final checks before entering. The engineers tested each support beam. The archaeologists packed their tools with steady hands. A medic walked through our small group and pressed each of our shoulders as if to remind us we were stepping into more than a room of old rock. I stood near the opening, listening to the slow breaths of the tunnel. They rose and fell in that same steady rhythm, as if the earth under us kept its own quiet pace. The first chamber opened wide as soon as we stepped inside. Our lights drew long shapes across the walls. Bones rested in patterns that did not belong to any collapse I had ever seen. Some skulls leaned against stone pillars as if placed there. A few ribs lay crossed in careful sets. A thin layer of dust clung to everything, yet it did not hide the order. The archaeologist walked along one row and said in a hushed tone that these remains had been moved long after the war. She pointed at a jawbone that held traces of newer mineral crust, as if someone had brushed dust off it not many decades earlier. The sidewalls carried marks I had not noticed in 1945. Some were carved symbols, shallow and uneven. Others looked like someone had pressed wet hands into the stone again and again until the shapes became fixed in faint outlines. Along the lower edge, thin droplets had formed in neat lines. They followed the same pattern I had seen outside. Each drop held its place as if pulled by something deeper in the rock, not by gravity alone. The deeper passage waited at the far end of the chamber. It opened wider than I remembered. The floor dipped into a gentle slope. The air there felt colder, even though the meters read almost the same as the rest of the chamber. When I stepped closer, the smells were stronger. Damp earth. Old sea. A trace of algae. It did not match any cave I had known. It carried a sense of age that made my hair rise. The archaeologist found a small leather pouch tucked into a crack near the wall. She opened it with care. Inside lay a thin notebook wrapped in oilcloth. The first pages were dated 1945. The handwriting looked disciplined and neat, likely from an officer. The words spoke of days spent inside the hill as the fighting raged above. Notes about rations, notes about civilians. Then the tone shifted. The officer wrote about hearing taps in the deep corridor, always in sets of 3. He said the sound did not match tools or falling stone. It felt deliberate, as if someone knocked slowly on the other side of a door. Later pages carried a different hand. The strokes grew shaky. The dates moved into the early 50s. This writer spoke about returning to the tunnel in secret, checking the seal, leaving food in the first chamber for reasons he did not explain. He wrote about the pressure in the stone and the sense that time moved strangely there. He mentioned others who came before him, men who served a watch long after the war had ended. I looked at the archaeologist as she read. She looked back with a quiet unease that matched my own. The interpreter continued translating, though his voice lowered. There came a line that stopped him. He read it again to be sure. It spoke of a door deeper in the hill. Not a wooden door or a metal door. A door made by pressure, by layers of stone shaped into a barrier over many years. The writer called it the inner door and said it must stay closed from both sides. The Japanese engineers exchanged glances. One tapped the stone with his knuckles. The sound came back flat. He said the passage ahead might not be natural. He said it could hide a second chamber, large enough to distort air movement. He stepped back and touched his chest as if the weight there had tightened. We pressed deeper, though every step felt like we were crossing into a place not meant for people. The walls showed more symbols, some carved by sharp tools, others drawn by fingertip and mineral dust. The interpreter read a few. He said some came from old Okinawan beliefs, though not placed in any known order. A few marks resembled warnings. Others resembled prayers. Further in, we reached a narrow side alcove. Bones rested inside it, but they did not belong to soldiers from the war. A plastic comb lay near one skull, the kind sold in the 1970s. A rusted flashlight sat beside another. A third set of remains wore a rubber sole still faintly visible on one foot. The archaeologist knelt down. She whispered that these people had entered the tunnel long after the war ended. They must have found another way in, and whatever drew them here had not let them return. A chill passed across the alcove even before any of us breathed. The droplets along the walls trembled in thin lines. They swayed, then steadied. I remember the officer from 1945 telling us to seal the tunnel. Now I understood why he had repeated it. Something inside had been waiting even then. We continued toward the deeper section. Our lights reached a wall far ahead. It did not look natural. Concrete mixed with limestone. Steel plates fused under mineral layers. Someone had built a barrier here with urgency. Across its rough face ran carvings in 2 languages, Japanese characters in long, slanted strokes. English scratched in crooked lines, dates from the late 40s and early 50s. Each message said the same thing: keep this closed. The interpreter read the Japanese lines twice, slower each time. He said they sounded like they were written by men who returned again and again to add more warnings. The English lines carried unit numbers that matched submarine groups from the war. The dates did not match wartime operations. They came from the years after surrender. Someone from our side had returned too. The air grew tighter the longer we stood near the barrier. It pressed behind our eyes and against our ribs. The engineer closest to the wall set his palm against the stone. He pulled it back at once. His hand shook. He said the wall felt warm, not cold. He said it pulsed under his touch, like the beat of a slow heart. Behind the barrier, the knocks began again. They came faint at first. 3 taps. A pause. 3 more. Each said a little clearer than the one before. The archaeologist's breathing grew shallow. The interpreter looked at the ground. The local workers stepped back toward the entrance. The taps carried no rush, no fear, only patience. They felt like they had been waiting for our return. The senior engineer called for a break to regroup outside, but the archaeologist argued that they needed samples from the wall. The interpreter said the families would want answers. I knew both sides were right. I also knew the hillside carried its own will. Some places guide you forward whether you choose it or not. We stood in that debate with our lights shaking slightly in our hands. The knocks came through the barrier once more, slow and steady, as if marking our time the same way they had marked the time of those who came before us. We gathered outside after the long push into the tunnel. The sun had dropped behind the ridge, yet the ground around the hill still held a faint coolness that did not match the warm air. I sat on a crate and tried to slow my breathing. The knocks behind the barrier stayed in my head. 3 taps. A pause. A pause. 3 more. They felt closer now, as if the rock no longer held them back. The senior engineer laid out our findings across a small table. He marked the position of the inner barrier, the alcove with the newer remains, and the lines of symbols carved into the stone. The archaeologists compared the notebook with their notes. They pointed out how the later writer had entered the tunnel years after the war. He had visited often. He had written about meeting others inside. He said they shared a duty that lasted beyond uniforms or nations. That idea unsettled me. Duty outside war. Duty inside a sealed tunnel. Duty passed from one generation to another without a map or a chain of command. I touched my wrist and felt the pulse beat steady. The rhythm matched the faint pulses in the stone earlier. I tried to ignore that. The interpreter returned from a phone call with local officials. He said there were old police records about people who had vanished near limestone ridges in the 50s and 60s. A farmer, a schoolboy, a worker who repaired water lines. Each had been last seen near a hill or a small cave. One report mentioned an old wartime tunnel. That report had been marked as restricted. The hillside we were working on was less than a mile from where the schoolboy had disappeared. A silence grew around the table. The younger engineers looked at the ground. The archaeologist rubbed her sleeve, thinking. The wind brushed against the grass in long strokes. Something in that sound reminded me of the slow breath of the tunnel. I asked the interpreter to describe the 50s notes again. He said the writer believed the inner door had to be watched from both sides. He said the writer spoke as if he had met Americans inside. That struck me hard. My squad never went that deep in 1945, but maybe another team had returned later. The English carvings confirmed someone had come back. The dates matched years when many veterans struggled with memories. Maybe some returned to places they could not leave behind. Night settled fully around us. The lights from our camp cast soft rings over the ground. The archaeologist studied the notebook again. She pointed to a line near the end of the later pages. It said the stone changed when the wrong touch reached it. The words were unclear, smudged by time and moisture. But the meaning grew stronger the longer she looked at them. The writer said the tunnel adjusted to those who entered. It did not like strangers. It did not like noise. It did not like light held too long in one place. The senior engineer said this might explain the strange readings from our meters. The oxygen level had stayed steady, yet several of us had felt pressure in our lungs. The temperature had stayed even, yet cold patches drifted across our clothes. He said underground air could behave in odd ways, but even he admitted that the regular pulse did not match airflow. Before we turned in for the night, I walked alone to the edge of the slope. The lights of our camp felt thin behind me. The hill rose like a quiet shape against the dark sky. The cracks along the plug glimmered faintly, as if beads of moisture had caught the starlight. I stood there for a long time, listening. At first there was nothing but wind. Then the faint pattern came again. 3 taps. A pause. 3 more. They sounded as if they came not from the tunnel but from the ground under my boots. I realized then that the barrier inside had not been the only path in or out. Someone had used another entrance for years. Someone might still be using it, and whatever lived deeper beneath that barrier might not have cared who sealed which doorway. It only cared that one door stayed closed. I returned to camp with my hands slightly shaking. I told no one. Some truths move better in silence until they must be spoken. I felt that time was coming soon. We entered the tunnel early the next morning to continue our work. Our lamps cut through the first chamber in long white beams. Dust rose where we stepped. The smell settled thick around us, as if the earth exhaled when we crossed its threshold. When I passed the row of arranged bones, I felt a small shift in the air. The droplets along the wall trembled again in those same narrow lines. The deeper passage pulled our attention at once. The barrier waited ahead, its rough face hidden under years of mineral crust. The writings in English and Japanese seemed sharper in the morning light, though no one had touched them overnight. The interpreter read the Japanese lines once more. He said they sounded like warnings from men who knew fear, yet also knew duty. The English lines talked about a watch. They did not say what was behind the barrier. They only said what must remain behind it. The senior engineer reviewed tape from the previous day. The audio carried gaps of static, then faint tapping. But a new sound crept through, slow and low, like distant water sliding along rock. He replayed it 3 times. Each time the room felt smaller. The sound did not match dripping water, wind, or loose stone. It had a slow sweep, as if something large shifted under a heavy surface. The interpreter looked pale as he listened. He said the sound resembled tide echoes in deep-sea caves he had visited as a boy. But this hill stood far from the shore. The archaeologist asked us to examine a thin mineral crust along the floor near the barrier. She had noticed it the day before, but studied it more now. It formed a faint arc, smooth and even. It reminded me of the tide line on old seawalls. But here, deep inside a dry hill, that line made no sense. When she touched it with a glove, the crust gave a soft crack, and a small puff of cold air passed over her hand. One of the Japanese engineers wandered toward the far left corner of the chamber. He tilted his head again, listening. He asked if we heard dripping behind the wall. None of us did. He said it sounded steady, like water falling in a deep place. The interpreter tried to speak to him, but the engineer kept moving forward until his hand brushed the stone. He blinked, stepped back, and looked confused. He asked why we were staring at him. He did not remember walking away. The archaeologist checked the notebook again, comparing dates. She said the later writers sometimes returned alone. He left offerings: rice, salt, a small lamp. He wrote as if he spoke to someone or something on the other side of the inner door. He said the knocking answered him sometimes. He wrote that it grew louder when outsiders stepped near the barrier. He said the stone learned their steps. We widened our search of the second chamber. A few yards from the barrier, we found markings that looked newer. Footprints pressed into thin mineral dust. The shapes match rubber soles. They belonged to no one in our team. The interpreter crouched beside them. He said they looked no more than a few decades old. I studied their path. They led toward the barrier, then stopped a short distance from it. There were no prints returning. I felt heat move slowly across my chest. Not from fear alone, but from recognition. This place held more years than our tools or charts could show. People had come here long after the war, some willingly, some by mistake, and not all had left. The senior engineer said we now had proof that the inner barrier had been reached by people we could not identify. He wanted to know how they had entered. He suggested a hidden opening on the far side of the hill. The local workers exchanged uneasy looks. The interpreter said a few families had whispered about old paths in the limestone that were never placed on maps. Paths that led down, not across. The archaeologist argued that we owed it to the families to continue. The engineers felt the pressure to deliver answers. Yet each step forward made the air heavier. The walls felt as if they leaned slightly inward. The narrow beads of moisture looked like they traced unseen shapes. I touched the rough face of the barrier. It felt warm again, steady and alive. I moved my hand away at once. My heart beat in a slow pattern that matched the pulse of the stone under my palm. 3 beats. A pause. 3 more. In that moment, the truth of the place settled in me. The tunnel had never belonged only to the war. It had been part of something older, something that crossed years and carried its own watch. Those who came after the war had understood that. They had added their marks. They had reinforced the barrier. They had left warnings for those who would follow. We stood before that wall in silence. The tunnel breathed around us. Somewhere behind the stone, the knocking began again. This time, it came in a slow, rising pattern, as if it knew we were almost ready to disturb what had stayed sealed for nearly half a century. Pressure rose on all sides by the time we gathered to decide what to do with the inner barrier. The archaeologists wanted a controlled breach so they could see what lay beyond. The engineers wanted proof of what caused the strange readings. Local officials wanted closure for families whose relatives might have vanished near the hill. Each goal pressed against the others. No matter how we chose, we would disturb something that had stayed untouched for many years. I stood at the rear of the group, watching the faces lit by our lamps. None of us looked certain. The air inside the first chamber still held its slow pulse. The droplets along the walls moved in faint lines, almost as if they followed the rhythm under our feet. When the senior engineer asked for my thoughts, I told him the truth. I said some doors were never meant to open. I said a man in 1945 had begged us not to enter deeper. I said we should trust the worry of those who came before. My voice stayed steady, but I felt the room tighten around me. The archaeologist answered with equal calm. She said the dead deserved to be brought home if they lay beyond that wall. She said the writing in the notebook spoke of people who wanted to protect what came after them. She believed the truth could guide families and historians. I respected her resolve, though I felt a knot form in my chest as she spoke. We agreed on a small breach first. No one would step through until we understood what waited beyond. The engineers marked the lower corner of the barrier, choosing a point that would allow a camera to slip through without weakening the whole structure. As they began drilling, the wall gave a soft tremor under each touch. The sound did not ring like normal concrete. It felt absorbed, as if the mass behind it swallowed the vibration. The tapping began again. 3 knocks. A pause. 3 more. They did not echo. They did not shift. They stayed steady, patient, almost expectant. One of the younger engineers froze with the drill still in his hands. The interpreter whispered that the knocks sounded closer than any before. I felt each one move through my ribs like a slow wave. When the drill broke through the last thin layer, a warm breath of air drifted over us. It felt different from the draft in the first chamber. It carried more weight, as if it came from a larger space. The smell deepened, damp sand, old water, something earthy and tired. The interpreter stepped back at once, covering his mouth. The archaeologist leaned forward as if drawn by it. We sent the camera through the small hole. The image shook at first as the lens adjusted. Then the darkness settled into view. At first, we saw nothing more than open black. As the camera moved, faint shapes appeared. The chamber beyond was wider than expected. The beam of light caught a long sweep of stone that curved downward. Droplets hung in thin lines from the ceiling, but they did not fall. They stayed suspended, swaying as if moved by a slow and distant breath. When the lens shifted left, we saw marks carved into the stone. They formed tall arcs, long and unsure, as if someone traced circles again and again without finishing them. Below these marks lay fragments of uniforms from both nations. Rusted metal, old cloth, some placed neatly, some scattered by time. The archaeologist breathed out a quiet word as she studied the image. She said this chamber belonged to more than one war and more than one decade. The camera turned deeper into the darkness. The rushing sound grew clearer on the audio feed. It did not match wind or dripping water. It swept in slow waves, rising and falling like something heavy shifting under a surface. The interpreter's hands tightened around the tablet. He whispered that it sounded like tide inside a closed place. As the camera moved lower, the beam met something unexpected. A wide groove ran across the floor. It curved in a long semicircle. The edges glistened like they had been wet not long ago. The archaeologist pressed closer to the screen. She said the shape looked like a bowl carved by water, but the tools that made it would have needed power and time far greater than any we brought here. Then the tapping returned on the audio feed, not behind the barrier this time, inside the chamber. 3 taps. A pause. 3 more. Each set carried a slight echo. They felt closer than the camera itself. The operator turned the lens toward the source. Nothing moved in the beam. The chamber remained empty. But the taps continued with a slow, steady patience that pressed cold against my spine. The senior engineer stepped back. He said we needed more data before thinking of opening the barrier further. The archaeologists argued they needed direct access. A debate grew in quiet tones. Their faces looked tense in the lamp glow. During this, one of the Japanese engineers stood near the wall and began speaking in low words. His voice changed tone, slower and deeper. The interpreter listened and grew pale. He said the man spoke in an old dialect, one he should not know. The words sounded like warnings passed down through families long before the war. They spoke of keeping a watch and holding back a tide beneath the island. When the engineer blinked, he looked confused and said he had not spoken at all. The senior engineer called a halt. We left the chamber and returned to the outside slope to reassess. My mind felt heavy. Each breath tasted of damp stone. Each step carried the weight of the tapping behind the barrier. We sat around our table again. The camera feed still played on a small screen beside us. The image showed the silent chamber beyond the barrier. Yet now and then, the droplets on the ceiling swayed in a soft rhythm. Not enough to fall, just enough to show movement. The archaeologist said we had proof the chamber extended deeper than we imagined. She said that if remains lay inside, we owed it to the families to continue. The senior engineer said the barrier showed signs of long pressure. If left alone, it might give way on its own. He feared a collapse could trap whoever entered next. The interpreter spoke softly. He said the old notebook used the word watch again and again. He believed the people who entered the tunnel after the war came not to uncover something, but to guard it. He asked who would take their place if we removed the wall entirely. No one answered him. The tapping continued once more from the speaker. 3 taps. A pause. 3 more. It sounded like a count. The night air cooled around us. The beams from the lamps reached only a short distance. The cracks in the plug gleamed again with tiny beads of moisture. They looked like they formed in new lines, as if guided by something inside. We decided to return at dawn to widen the breach. Some decisions take hold even when fear warns against them. Some choices slip into place like stones settling in a wall. Before I lay down that night, I felt the ground under me pulse once, slow and deep. Whether it came from the earth or my own memory, I could not say. But it felt like the hill knew we were not finished. Dawn came pale and quiet. No wind moved across the grass. The whole hill felt like it waited for our return. We gathered at the opening with less talk than the day before. Even the younger engineers kept their voices low. The air carried that same damp breath, steady and slow. We widened the breach just enough for one person to stand close and work the tools. The stone around the cut felt softer than it should, as if time inside the hill followed its own pace. When the last section loosened, a thin slice of the inner chamber came into full view. The smell deepened at once. Old water, cold rock, a hint of something living far below. We pushed the camera through again. This time, the droplets along the ceiling swayed in long arcs, like something large had moved beneath them. The rushing sound rose and fell in slow waves. The tapping followed. 3 knocks. A pause. 3 more. The rhythm stayed steady, as if marking a moment we could not see. The senior engineer stepped close to inspect the breach. Behind him, the archaeologist studied the deeper edge of the chamber. She pointed toward a faint shift in the light. The groove on the floor glimmered as though new moisture had gathered along its curve. The interpreter whispered that it looked like the outline of something rising, then sinking again. Before any of us spoke, a single tremor passed through the hill. Not violent, not sharp, just a slow push that moved from the ground into our boots. Dust drifted from the ceiling of the first chamber. The droplets lining the walls shook together in thin chains. The tapping stopped. Silence spread through the stones. The senior engineer called for a retreat to reassess, but another tremor followed, stronger than the first. The breach widened by itself, a thin crack stretching upward. Cold air poured out in a long breath that hit our faces and settled in our clothes. I felt fear rise in a way I had not felt since the war. The same tightness in the chest, the same awareness of something near that did not belong in daylight. I knew then that the hill would not hold the barrier much longer. We moved fast. Charges were placed along the approach to collapse the corridor leading to the inner door. No one argued. No one hesitated. We backed out as the final wires were set. The interpreter whispered a short prayer. The archaeologist touched the side of the hill with a steady hand, almost grateful. The blast came low and deep. The hill shook, then settled. Dust filled the air. When it cleared, the passage had folded in on itself. New stone faces replaced old paths. The breach had vanished under tons of twisted rock. For a short moment, the ground under us pulsed once more. Slow. Heavy. Final. Then everything fell still. We stood there breathing hard, knowing we had closed something that should not open again. The slope stayed quiet after the collapse. No dust drifted back out of the sealed passage. No tapping returned through the stone. Only a low warmth remained in the ground beneath our boots, fading little by little as the morning brightened. The senior engineer checked his instruments, though his hands shook slightly. Each reading came back clean. Normal air, normal pressure. No sign of movement under the hill. He looked relieved, yet uneasy, like a man who knows calm can hide more than noise. We walked the site together to make sure no new cracks had formed. The archaeologist moved slower than usual. She paused at the fallen rubble and touched the piece of limestone still warm from the blast. She whispered that the barrier had shifted on its own before we set the charges. She believed we had acted just in time. The interpreter stood beside her, reading the air as if it carried words none of us could hear. He said the hill felt empty now, but not truly at rest. By midday, we gathered near the equipment tables to write our preliminary report. The wording changed many times. The officials wanted simple language. They wanted the story to follow clear lines. Structural weakness. Risk of collapse. Partial recovery of remains. Tunnel unsafe for entry. A respectful end to a wartime site. Nothing more, nothing less. No mention of knocking behind the barrier or footprints from later years. No mention of the notebook pages written long after the war. No mention of the pressure in the stone that moved like breath. I understood why. Some truths fit into records. Others do not. Some places leave marks that only the people who stood there can carry. History books stay quiet, where memory must speak softly. We returned the recovered remains to the local officials. The families gathered in a small building near the coast. They bowed to us in thanks. Some cried. Others smiled in quiet relief. None asked what else we had seen below the hill. They only wanted peace for those they had waited for half a lifetime. I felt grateful we could give them that much, even if we could not give the full truth. When I walked outside afterward, the sea lay calm under a pale sky. The breeze carried the clean salt of the waves, not the heavy scent of the tunnel. I breathed deeper than I had in days, yet a part of me stayed with the collapsed passage, listening for sounds that no longer reached the surface. That night, I sat alone near the hill one last time. The camp had gone quiet. The lights dimmed. The grass moved in slow strokes across the slope. I placed my hand on the earth. It felt cool now, settled and still. No pulse, no warmth, no rhythm beneath the stone. But as I turned to leave, a soft echo rose from somewhere deep inside the hill. Not a knock, not a call, just a faint pressure, like the last breath of a long closed space adjusting to its new shape. It faded at once, almost gentle, almost grateful. I walked back toward the lights with the sense that the door had not vanished. It had only moved deeper. We left the site 2 days later. The hill stood behind us without a sound, its surface calm, its cracks sealed under fresh layers of earth. The officials posted warning signs and marked the whole slope as unsafe. Fences went up. Paths were closed. The story became simple in the public record. A collapsed wartime tunnel, a risk to hikers. Nothing more. Our team packed in silence. The archaeologist closed the notebook fragments in a small case. She said the pages would be stored in a controlled archive. She did not say if anyone would ever read them. The interpreter took one last look at the ridge, then bowed his head as if giving respect to those who had kept watch there long before us. The engineers drove stakes into the ground for final measurements, though their eyes kept drifting toward the slope as if expecting it to shift again. Before I boarded the transport, I walked a slow circle around the base of the hill. The soil felt firm under my boots. No cool breath rose from the cracks anymore. No sense of movement pressed through the stone. Still, I paused once and rested my hand on a patch of limestone. It held steady under my palm. Yet in that small moment, a memory rose so sharply that it felt new again. 3 knocks. A pause. 3 more. The same rhythm that had followed me for nearly 50 years. I lowered my hand and stepped back. The hill offered no answer. It held its silence the way a veteran holds certain stories, not to hide them, but because they live too deep to share in full. When our convoy pulled away, I watched the ridge until it vanished behind the trees. I knew we had closed the tunnel the best way we could. I also knew the land would keep the rest. Some places carry their own watch, long after people leave. The island stayed quiet as we drove north, the wind moving through the fields in slow waves, steady as breath. I returned home with a quiet weight I could not set down. Days passed in calm routines, yet the memory of that hill stayed close. When the house settled that night, I sometimes caught the faint echo of a rhythm I knew too well. 3 knocks. A pause. 3 more. It might have been old pipes or shifting wood. Yet each time it reached me, I felt the same stillness I had felt inside the tunnel, as if the earth itself carried reminders across years and miles. I tried to explain the experience once, but the words did not come easily. The truth was not about danger alone. It was about standing at the edge of something older than war, older than any story I had learned as a young Marine. We went there to recover what time had taken. Instead, we found signs of a long watch held by people from both sides, men who understood that some doors exist to stay closed, not because of fear, but because balance depends on it. I think about the officer from 1945, the one who begged us to seal the tunnel. I think about the men who returned in the 50s to strengthen the wall. I think about the later visitors who never came back. Each of them felt the same quiet pull, the same slow breath moving through the stone. They answered it in their own way. Maybe we did too, even if we reached our choice late. The tunnel is gone now, buried under rock we placed with our own hands. Yet the land remembers. The moisture that clung to the walls, the cool pulse under the floor, the thin chains of droplets that moved in their own rhythm. These small things told a story that never reached paper. A story about time, pressure, and something waiting far below the surface. I do not claim to understand what lived beneath Okinawa. I only know it listened. And when we opened the hill again, after almost half a century, it answered with the same patience it had shown a young soldier in 1945. Now, when I wait before dawn and the world is still, I sit quietly and let the memories settle. Some are sharp. Some drift like mist. All of them lead back to that sealed place and the lesson it left with me, simple and steady. Not every door is meant for light. Some stay closed because something on the other side keeps its own watch, counting time in slow breaths, waiting for the world above to understand. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. And for more amazing horror stories, just click the ones showing right now on your screen.